It's unbelievable the degree to which our sanity depends on a functioning sociological structure. And here's why. Well, first of all, you kind of need to know what to do every day. You have to have a routine because you're an animal. You know, if you have a dog or a cat, dogs are a really good example of this. Dogs like routine. They like to be walked the number of times a day that they're supposed to be walked, and they get quite sick very rapidly if you don't routinize their days. Children are exactly the same way. Now, you can overdo it, right? But still, you know, you need to know approximately when you should get up. It should be approximately the same every day. You need to know approximately when you're going to eat. You need to know what you're going to eat. You need to know who you're going to eat with. You need to know where to buy your food. It's like 80% of your life, 70% of your life, something like that, consists of those things that you do every single day, that you repeat. And those are often the things that people think about as the trivial elements of their life, but one of the things I would like to point out to you, if you do the mathematics, I did this with a client of mine who was having a hard time putting his child to bed. They were having a fight every night. And I knew by that time, the studies indicate that most parents only spend 20 minutes per day of one-on-one time with their child. Now, the reason for that is that people are busy, and it's actually not that easy to parse out 20 minutes of one-on-one time. It's a lot bloody more time than you think. But that's all there is, 20 minutes. And he's spending like 40 minutes a day fighting with this kid, trying to get the kid to go to bed. And that's not very entertaining. You know, you think, well, it's just having a scrap with the kid about going to bed. But it's no. If it happens every day, it's a catastrophe. So you do the math. So we'll say 5 hours a week for the sake of argument, just to keep it simple. It's 20 hours a month. It's 240 hours a year. That's 6 40-hour work weeks. So that guy was basically spending a month and a half of work weeks doing absolutely nothing but having a wretched time fighting with his son, trying to get him to go to bed. Horrible, right? That's just way too much time to spend doing something like that if you want to actually have a positive relationship with someone, because it's just too punishing. Well, so you need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane. Now, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit odd, you can deviate 5% from the norm, or 10% from the norm, or something like that, carefully and cautiously, as long as the rest of you is all well ordered in a normative manner. You might be able to get away with that, and you might be able to sustain it across time, and people might be able to tolerate you if you do it, or maybe you'll get really lucky and you happen to be creative but reasonably well put together, and people will actually be happy that there's something idiosyncratic and unique about you. But even under those circumstances, mostly what you want is to have a routine that's disciplined, that's predictable, and bloody well stick to it. You're going to be way healthier and happier and saner if you do that. And then the other thing that you need, because this is one of the things the psychoanalysts got wrong, I think, is that they overestimated the degree to which sanity was a consequence of being properly structured internally, you know. Because from the psychoanalytic point of view, you're sort of an ego, and that ego is inside you. And of course, it rests on an unconscious structure. But the purpose of psychoanalysis is to sort out that unconscious structure and the ego on top of it, and to make you a fully functioning and autonomous individual. But there's a problem with that, because the reason that you're sane as a fully functional and autonomous human being isn't because you've organized your psyche, even though that's important. The reason that you're sane if you have a well-organized unconscious and ego is because other people can tolerate having you around for reasonably extensive periods of time, and will cuff you across the back of the head every time you do something so stupid that people will dislike you permanently if you continue. And so what people are doing to each other all the time, just non-stop, is broadcasting sanity signals back and forth, right? It's like you smile at people if they're not only behaving properly, but behaving in a way that you would like to see them continue to behave. You frown at them if they're not, you ignore them if they're not, you shun them, you roll your eyes at them, you manifest a disgust face, you don't listen to them, you interrupt them, you won't cooperate with them, you won't compete with them. It's like you're blasting signals at other people about how to regulate their behavior so frequently, well, it just makes up all of your social interaction. That's why we face each other, and we have emotional displays on our face, and we're looking at each other's eyes, and we know as much as we can about what's going on with each other, given that we don't have immediate access to the contents of their consciousness. And so partly what you're doing with your routine is establishing yourself as a credible, reliable, trustworthy, potentially interesting human being who isn't going to do anything too erratic at any moment. And everyone else is around there tapping you into shape, making sure that that's exactly what you are. And that's how you stay sane. And so what happens to people too, if they don't have a routine and they get isolated, is they start to drift. And they drift badly because the world is too complicated for you to keep it organized all by yourself. You just cannot do it. So we outsource the problem of sanity. And it's very intelligent that we outsource the problem of sanity, because sanity is an impossibly complex problem. And so the way that we manage the incredibly complex problem is we have a very large number of brains working simultaneously on the problem all the time. It's like a stock market for sanity. I use that definition with purpose, because the stock market does the same kind of impossible thing, right? Because it tries to price things, which is impossible. How many things are there? Like 1 billion. How in the world do you decide what the price is? You can't decide what the price is. That's why you have a stock market. Well, in a free market, I mean for consumer goods, is everyone's voting on what the price of everything is all the time. And that's the way we figure it out, because it's technically impossible. That's partly why the stock market explodes now and then, and there's bubbles and all that sort of thing. But anyways, the point is, things are chaotic. In Alice in Wonderland, when Alice goes down the rabbit hole, that's the underworld, right? So now she's gone into the substructure of being. And she meets the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is Mother Nature. And Mother Nature is running around yelling, "Off with their heads, off with their heads," which is, of course, what Mother Nature does. And she tells Alice, "In my kingdom, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place." And that's exactly right. And that's a description of, in fact, evolutionary biologists and psychologists have picked up on that phrase. They call it the Red Queen problem. And the Red Queen problem is everything's after you all the time, and you're not smart enough to do anything about it, or enough about it. And so that's a permanent existential problem. So how do you deal with that? You've got a biological structure. So your embodiment is part of the solution to the problem. And then you're enculturated. And because you're enculturated, you're taught a lot of things that you need to know, but mostly what you're taught is how to communicate with other people in an acceptable manner. And then once you can communicate with people in an acceptable manner, then you can outsource your problems constantly, which you're doing constantly. And so we're in this continual dynamic exchange of problem solving. So if you're a socialized person, that's what you get access to. The difference between the fool and someone who's courageous, right, from an archetypal perspective. Abraham is a fool, obviously, when he starts his adventures. I mean, the story lays it out in that manner. He's far too old to be leaving home, for example. He's a late bloomer, and then he has a lot of catastrophic adventures along the way. And certainly you could imagine that had you encountered him when he first encountered the famine in the land of strangers, when he first went out, the idea that he had followed his misguided intuitions would have been self-evident. But in the Abrahamic stories, there is this call to get out and do. And that's it. And the thing is that one of the things I've learned, to make it concretely, is that I've done a lot of different things in my life. And every time I did a new thing, I was a fool. I did it badly. I was an imposter, right? Because when you first start to do something, you don't know what you're doing. But that's okay. That's an acceptance of your vulnerability, right? And your ignorance. That's humility in some sense. The willingness to be a fool in the land of strangers. That's it. The willingness to be a fool in the land of strangers. And that's an act of courage, because you also reveal your vulnerability to the world by stumbling around. But as long as you're stumbling forward, then you're going to move forward. Now, how do you do that more concretely? You aim at an ideal, right? And you aim at an ideal that's beyond you. Now, maybe you don't aim to begin with at an ideal that's so beyond you that you're crushed by its magnificence, Maybe that's too demotivating to move you. But you could at least conceptualize yourself as the you that you are, with fewer of the faults that you know of. And that's a good start. And I also think that's associated with the idea of humility. Take stock. Figure out how it is that you're not who you could be. And then move in that direction. And accept the consequences. You're going to get slapped a lot.
But maybe with each slap, you'll straighten up a little bit. Especially if you listen, even to the people who are slapping you. Because sometimes they're the ones who can reveal for you very quickly where it is that you're weak and insufficient, so that you won't have to be that way in the future.
As you see with people all the time is that maybe they're trying to stumble forward towards their ideal, as poorly defined as it might be, but then they're afraid, right? They're afraid about what they might encounter, and that stops them, because fear does stop people. It freezes you like a prey animal, and so people move ahead, but then they get afraid, and then they stop moving ahead. And that's not so good, because negative emotion is a really powerful motivator. So we're more motivated by negative emotion than positive emotion. Quantitatively speaking, you can measure that. And that's, I think, because we can only be so happy, but we can really be suffering and dead, you know? So we have to pay more attention to the negative. And that's bad, because the negative can stop you. And then in my clinical practice, you know, I often talk to people who are trying to make a difficult life decision, and they're weighing out the costs and the benefits of making the life decision, you know? And one of the things I always talk to them about is, wait a second, that's an incomplete analysis. You have to weigh out the benefits and the costs of doing this. And you have to weigh out the costs and benefits of not doing it. And that's not the same as the zero that you assume that you're starting with, right? Because to not make a decision, it also has a cost. And sometimes the cost of not making a decision is far worse than the cost of making a decision, even if the decision is risky. And so one of the things you can derive from that, and this is very useful, I think, is that this is also, I think, why it's so useful to contemplate your mortality, so to speak, is you're screwed no matter what you do. You know, and that actually frees you, is that you have path A that has catastrophes and you have path B that has catastrophes, and you don't get to have the no catastrophe path, but you get to pick which one. And that's really something, because if you know that there's terrible risk associated with everything that you do and don't do, then you can afford to take some risks, because you're not, you know, and this is all within the arc metaphor. I'm still making the case that despite the fact that your life is essentially catastrophic, you can make a covenant with the highest ideal, and that will take you through it the best way possible. I'm still making that case. So then you think, okay, well, I'm trying to make this decision. I'm going to go try to do something difficult, and isn't that terrifying? And then you think, yeah, but wait a minute. What's really terrifying is not doing it. And then you think about the cost of not doing it. So in the future authoring program, we have people do this little meditative exercise, which is, okay, just think about your insufficiencies by your own definition, right? The way that you don't do what you know you should do. About the things that you do that you shouldn't do, that you know you shouldn't do beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? There's some things like that. That's bad habits and poor aim and all of the resentment and hatred and aggression and unresolved conflicts and all those things that are dementing you and warping you, and then think, okay, those things get the upper hand, man. They get the upper hand, and they take you the worst possible place you could go in the next 3 to 5 years. What exactly does that look like? And so you sketch all that out, and you think, hey, I don't want to go there. And so the next time that a temptation comes up, you think, well, it'd be a lot better for me if I didn't succumb to this temptation. It's like, that's kind of weak, eh? You'd look a little better if you didn't eat like a cheesecake a day or something like that. You know, that's something, but it's not the same as, I'm going to have diabetes and I'm going to lose my damn leg in 5 years if I don't get my eating under control. That's motivating. And so then the temptation comes along and you think, oh, how about no? Seriously, how about no? Not just because a higher good would be obtained if I avoided it, but because a terrible catastrophe would be averted if I didn't. And so, well, so you want to get your fear behind you, right? You want to get it behind you where it's pushing you forward instead of in front of you where it's stopping you. And you get your fear behind you pushing you forward by actually thinking through the consequences of not putting your life together. And the least of those is that you waste it and suffer, right? Because you're going to suffer anyways, man. So you waste it and suffer. That's a bad deal. Because maybe if you're going to suffer, you could at least do something noble and glorious and upright and powerful and honorable and admirable and helpful and difficult. You know, that's just so much better. And maybe that's good enough so that you think, hey, you know, little suffering, it's basically worth it. At least it's a way forward, you know? At least it's a way forward.
The role of the victim, which is a painful role to have, because something bad happened to you to be a victim. Mm-hmm. But it's something that society struggles with. What about people who feel like they're a victim?
They're right. They're victimizers too. Like, everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. You know, well, illness strikes people randomly. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it. Where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's existentialists, especially in the 1950s, talked about that all the time. They talked about it as thrownness, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just desserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards. Well, what do? You play the hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No, because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy. But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. That's not the point. The point is, you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. You know, if you take someone who's doing quite well in life and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past, or perhaps of the present. You know, and no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. You've got no better protection in life than doing that.
Not enough simply for the library to be there. There needs a certain mediation of the institution. So, for example, we could have there's a piano on the other side of this room. You know, we could say, well, there's a piano. You're free to play the piano, but I can't play the piano. I don't know the chords and the scales. I haven't. And yet, if I did all that, then what I can make happen on the piano is infinitely richer than if I've never learned to play the piano. And I suppose when we talk about rescuing the values of the treasure trove,
that's discipline as the precondition for freedom.
Yes.
Right, which is actually a Nietzschean idea, at least in part. I mean, it's older than that. It's the apprenticeship idea. It's that before you can be a painter who can paint what's beyond mere memory, you have to inculcate that disciplined skill, and a lot of that is painful repetition and hard grinding work. It's the sacrifice of the present for the future. But once you manage that, then things open up. And virtually everything you learn of value is like that's very, very, very difficult to learn to write. And there's arbitrary rules that you have to follow and bind yourself to. And while you're learning those rules, the probability that you have any creative freedom to speak of or any facility with the rules is very low. You're a rank beginner. And even to some degree, whatever creativity you have is going to have to be stifled while you're passing through that keyhole. But if you pass through it, then something massive opens up on the other side. And it is definitely the case that disciplinary institutions, universities, are exactly that, is they're places of guidance, and they're places to encourage people to develop the discipline that's necessary to see beyond the discipline. I mean, that's why we have disciplines, right? I mean, the words aren't there by accident. You have to narrow yourself first, and then you can broaden outward. And that's part of the process of maturation. That's part of the sacrifice of childhood. Say, in childhood, you're nothing but potential, but it's not realized and you don't know how to realize it. And so then the question is, well, how do you get to a point where you realize the potential? And the answer is, you sacrifice almost all of it to a single direction. This is Nietzsche's commentary on the Catholic Church. He's a great admirer of the Catholic Church, despite the fact that he was also a radical critic of Christianity. See, the thing about the Catholic Church is that it forced everything to be interpreted within a single explanatory framework. And that was a discipline. And once that discipline was established, then the disciplined mind could explode in every direction, which is precisely what happened. And that's the thing about growing up, is that when you're a teenager and a young adult, you have to sacrifice everything you could have been as a child to be the one thing that you're aiming at. But then that opens up, and the universities are part and parcel of that process. And you need the guidance, because the library is too large to wander through it unaided.
These creatures engage in dominance disputes, and I think dominance is the right way to think about it, because lobsters aren't very empathic and they're not very social, and so it really is the toughest lobster that wins. And what's so cool about the lobster is that when a lobster wins, he flexes and gets bigger, so he looks bigger, because he's a winner. It's like he's advertising that. And the neurochemical system that makes him flex is serotonergic. And you think, well, who cares? What the hell does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It's the same chemical that's affected by antidepressants in human beings. And so, like, if you're depressed, you're a defeated lobster. Like, they're like this. I'm small. I'm not, things are dangerous. I don't want to fight. You give somebody an antidepressant, it's like up they stretch, and then they're ready to, like, take on the world again. Well, if you give lobsters who just got defeated in a fight serotonin, then they stretch out and they'll fight again. And that's, like, we separated from those creatures on the evolutionary timescale somewhere between 350 and 600 million years ago, and the damn neurochemistry is the same. And so that's another indication of just how important hierarchies of authority are. I mean, they've been conserved since the time of lobsters, right? There weren't trees around when lobsters first manifested themselves on the planet. And so what that means is these hierarchies that I've been talking about, those things are older than trees. And so one of the truisms for what constitutes real from a Darwinian perspective is that which has been around the longest period of time, right? Because it's had the longest period of time to exert selection pressure. Well, we know we evolved and lived in trees something on the order of 60 million years ago. We're talking 10 times as far back as that for the hierarchy. And so the idea that human beings, that the hierarchy is something that has exerted selection pressure on human beings is, I don't think that's not a disputable issue. How it's done it and exactly what that means, we can argue about, but like that sort of biological continuity is just absolutely unbelievable. It was funny because I revealed this finding. I didn't discover this, I read about it, but I talked to my graduate students about it. I used to take them out for breakfast, and they were a very contentious, snappy bunch. And they were always trying to one-up each other, and they were quite witty. And for like 6 months, until it got very annoying, every time one of them one-upped the other, they'd stretch themselves out and like snap their hands like... So that was very funny. It was really very funny. So you see this in lobsters, and so that's pretty amazing. And one of the other things that's really cool about lobsters is that, let's say you've been like top lobster for a long time, but you're getting kind of old, and some young lobster just, whales the hell out of you, and so you're all depressed. But the thing is, your brain is dominant. But you don't have much of a brain because you're a lobster. And so now what are you going to do? Because you just lost. And the answer is, well, your brain will dissolve. And then you'll grow a subordinate brain. Yeah, and so that's worth thinking about too, right? Here for a couple of reasons. First of all, if any of you have ever been seriously defeated in life, you know what that's like. It's like it's a death, a descent, a dissolution, and if you're lucky, a regrowth, and maybe not as the same person. That's what happens to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Their brains undergo permanent neurological transformation. And they then inhabit a world that's much more dangerous than the world that they inhabited to begin with. But we also know too, if you have post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, that your hippocampus shrinks, right? It dies and shrinks. And you can sometimes get it to grow back. Your hippocampus shrinks and your amygdala grows. And the amygdala increases emotional sensitivity, and the hippocampus inhibits emotional sensitivity. And so if you've been badly defeated, the hippocampus shrinks and the amygdala grows. Now, if you recover, the hippocampus will regrow, and antidepressants actually seem to help that, but the damn amygdala never shrinks again. And so, well, so that's another lesson from the lobster. It's quite a terrifying one, but it's one, like, it's so interesting that you can relate to that, right? It's like, I get what that poor crustacean's going through, you know. That the way that you fortify your faith in being and in life, in your own existence, isn't to try to convince yourself of the existence of a transcendent power that you could believe in the same way that you believe in a set of empirical facts. I don't think that's the right approach. I think it's a weak approach, actually. I don't think that's the right cognitive technology for that set of problems. You know, that's more technology that you'd use if you were trying to solve a scientific problem. It's more something that needs to be embedded in action rather than in stateable belief. And the way that you fortify your faith in life is to assume the best, something like that, and then to act courageously in relationship to that. That's tantamount to expressing your faith in the highest possible good. It's tantamount to expressing your faith in God. And it's not a matter of stating, well, I believe in the existence of a transcendent deity, because in some sense, who cares what you believe? I mean, you might and all that, but that's not the issue. That's not the issue. The issue, it seems to me, is how you act. And I was thinking about this intensely when I was thinking about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, because of course you know that Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God, right? And who was a great, great critic of Christianity, a vicious critic of institutional Christianity, in the best sense, you know. And he announced the death of God, and he said that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphant proclamation, even though it's often read that way. Nietzsche's conclusion from the death of God, the fact that our ethical systems were going to collapse when the foundation was pulled out from underneath them, he believed that human beings would have to find their own values, to create their own values. And there's a problem with that, because it doesn't seem, this is something Carl Jung was very thorough in investigating, it doesn't really look like people are capable of creating their own values, because you're not really capable of molding yourself just any old way you want to be. Like, you have a nature that you have to contend with. And so it isn't a matter of creating our own values, because we don't have that capacity. It might be a matter of rediscovering those values, which is what Jung was attempting to do. And so I think Nietzsche was actually profoundly wrong in that recommendation. I think he was psychologically wrong. Now, you know, Dostoevsky wrote in many ways in parallel to Nietzsche and was a great influence on Nietzsche. Their lives parallel each other to a degree that's somewhat miraculous, and in some sense it's quite uncanny. Dostoevsky was obviously a literary figure, whereas Nietzsche was a philosopher, a literary philosopher, but still a philosopher. And Dostoevsky wrestled with exactly the same problems that Nietzsche wrestled with, but he did it in a different way. He did it in a literary manner. And he has this great book, The Brothers Karamazov, and in that book, the hero of the book is really Alyosha, who's a monastic novitiate, a very good guy, kind of not an intellect, but a person of great character, you know. But he has a brother, Ivan, who's his older brother, who's a great intellect and a very handsome soldier and a brave man. And like Dostoevsky's villains, Ivan isn't exactly a villain, but that's close enough. Dostoevsky makes his villains extraordinarily powerful. So if Dostoevsky's trying to work out an argument, he clothes the argument in the flesh of one of his characters. And if it's an argument he doesn't agree with, then he makes that character as strong as he possibly can, as strong and as attractive and intelligent as he possibly can, and then he lets him just have at her. And so Ivan is constantly attacking Alyosha, and from every direction trying to knock him off his perch of faith, let's say. And Alyosha can't address a single one of Ivan's criticisms. He doesn't have the intellect for it, and Ivan has a devastating intellect. It's devastating to himself as well. What happens in The Brothers Karamazov essentially is that Alyosha continues to act out his commitment to the good, let's say, and in that manner he's triumphant. It doesn't matter that he loses the arguments, because the arguments aren't exactly the point. The arguments in some sense are a side issue, because the issue is, and this is the existential issue, the issue is not what you believe as if it's a set of facts, but how you conduct yourself in the world. Final rule. It's called pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, and it's the most personal chapter in the book. It's a lot about my daughter. And my daughter was very ill when she was a kid, but particularly when she was a teenager. She had a very terrible time of it.
She had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and when she was between the ages of 14 and 16, it first destroyed her hip, which had to be replaced, and then it destroyed the ankle on her other leg, which had to be replaced. And she walked around for 2 years on broken legs, and she was taking massive doses of opiates and could hardly stay awake. And she had this advanced autoimmune disease, which produced all sorts of other symptoms that were just as bad as the joint degeneration, but which are harder to describe. And so it's just bloody brutal. You know, and as a test of your faith, there's almost nothing that's more direct than a serious illness inflicted upon an innocent child, right? And so the chapter's a meditation on that, and also on, well, what to do in a situation like that, because everyone is going to have a situation like that in some sense, you know, because you'll be faced with illness in the people that you love and in crisis. And so it's a practical guide to coping with those sorts of things. Like, and one of the things you do when you're overwhelmed by crisis is you shorten your time frame. You know, it's like you can't think about next month. Maybe you can't even bloody well think about next week, or maybe not even tomorrow. You know, because now is just so overwhelming that that's all there is. It's like, and that's what you do. You cut your time frame back until you can cope with it. And if it's not the next week that you see how to get through, then it's the next day. And if it's not the next day, then it's the next hour. And if it's not the next hour, then it's the next minute. And you know, people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. You know, I let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, you know, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you know, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. And there's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, you know. And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, you know, nose her a bit. And then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you know, you have to look for that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And, you know, you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times. And maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, you know, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. You know, there's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, is this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist. And maybe we could make the world into a better place, you know? And it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And that's the end of 12 Rules for Life. Thank you. What happens if you're playing the proper game is that you integrate your emotions underneath your thinking, something like that. So they're all working in the same direction. Make your anxiety work against you or for you. I made a program called the Future Authoring Program that I think helps people do that. Because one of the things you see when you're talking to people and they're trying to solve problems is that they're afraid to face the problem. And so then their anxiety is working against them, and you can think about it as antagonistic to rationality. But then I could say, well, why don't you think for a while about what your life would be like if you didn't face this problem?
Because if you think that through, if you have a problem and you really think through what the consequences are going to be in 3 to 5 years of not facing it, then you're going to get more afraid of not facing it than facing it. And that's great, because then your anxiety, instead of standing in front of you, instead of you having a dragon that's guarding the path in front of you, you have one chasing you down the path from behind. That's a lot more useful. And so, that's just a minimal example of the utility of getting your emotions and your thoughts aligned the same way. The same thing happens with aggression. One of the most common reasons that people come and seek psychotherapy really is because they're too agreeable. But what that means is they're not assertive enough. They haven't integrated their capacity for aggression, and so other people can push them around. And they're very conflict avoidant. And so the consequences of that across time is that you don't stand up for yourself well enough, and you get taken advantage of, and that spirals badly downward. And so partly what you do when you're doing assertiveness training with people is you find out what they're angry about. And they're usually angry, if they're not assertive enough, because other people are taking advantage of them, or you could say because they're not putting their own necessities forward with enough force. It's hard to distinguish between those two things. But anyways, you get them to talk about what they're angry about. That often makes them cry, often many times. And then you get them to kind of envision what they would want to have instead, which they're often afraid to do, because people are afraid to think about what they want, because that makes it more clear when they're not getting it, and that's painful, right? Or maybe they're afraid of hoping, so they won't specify a clear aim. But anyways, you get them to think about what they might want instead. You get them to think about the costs of not pursuing that, and then you help them develop strategies for integrating their aggression and with their thinking, so that they can come up with a plan to approach the world in a more confident way. So for example, someone might come to me and say, I'm being bullied badly at work. And so then I'll say, well, what are your options? Do you have to put up with it? Well, we'll figure that out, because maybe you do. Maybe you don't have options. But here's how to find out. Get your damn CV together, so it's pristine, right? It's ready to go. Get over your fear of a new interview, because people are generally afraid of that. Get over your fear of applying for a new job. Start thinking about what it would mean to have a different job. Start thinking about what it would mean to have a better job even, because maybe your fear is just making you stuck here. But I can tell you one thing, if someone's picking on you at work and you don't have options, you lose. So you get the person to start building a strategy. It's like, okay, if you're going to tell this person to stop, you have to know how to make them stop. And the one thing you need for sure is an option. And if you don't have an option, then maybe we start thinking about the fact that you need some more training or something like that, because you cannot negotiate if you don't have any power, especially if you're dealing with someone who's really out to get you or really disagreeable. If you don't have a leg to stand on, they'll just push you over, and maybe they'll jump on you too, because that's what they're like and they enjoy it anyways. So it's no joke. So you put your options behind you, and then you start to think about strategy. So I tell people, look, if you're being harassed at work, you document it every time it happens and you write it down. So you've got like 20 stories about it, and it's fully documented. And then you go confront the person at some point, but with at least 3 pieces of evidence. And you have some sense of what you tell them about what will happen if they don't stop. So you have to figure out, well, if they don't stop, what are you going to do about it? Leave? Not if you can't leave. So you have to be able to, wield a big stick and speak softly. But you see, that way that's how you take your aggression, which is an absolutely necessary part of your psyche, and manifest it up into a sophisticated means of dealing with the world. You don't just suppress it. You say, well, I should be able to put up with it, or I wish I wasn't so angry, or something. It's like, forget that. That's all that'll happen is your blood pressure will stay high and you'll die of a heart attack, because anger, for example, is a very toxic emotion. And it does cause heart damage over time. It's the only emotion that we really know that's been linked to things like cardiovascular risk. And anger is toxic, because it's like you're driving a car, you're stepping on the gas and pushing on the brake at the same time, because anger tells you to run away and to attack at the same time, because you don't know what's going to happen. And so it really amps up the physiological demand on your body, including your heart and your musculature. So if you stay like that for like 10 years, you're going to age 20 years. And that's a bad plan. So, you take your underground emotions and you integrate them into a sophisticated
Reality.